The basic question that we're going to think about over the next 4 sessions is a philosophical question. What is the world like, and how do we fit into it? It's a question that calls for a general account of reality, which can incorporate what the sciences are telling us about nature, and which can make sense of the possibility of humans having such knowledge. As you'll have seen from the brief summary of this course when you signed up for it, we're going to be touching on some early modern and medieval ideas about nature, as well as contemporary ideas. So let me try to give you some background and context then, before we get into the first lecture. The lay theologian and essayist C.S. Lewis, who held the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Magdalen College, Cambridge, described the highest achievements of the Middle Ages as the, quote, medieval synthesis itself, the whole organization of their theology, science, and history into a single complex, harmonious mental model. According to C.S. Lewis, the medieval mind had a genius for developing systems in which, quote, highly original and soaring philosophical speculation squeezes itself into a rigid dialectical pattern copied from Aristotle. Whilst strict demarcations between medieval and early modern philosophy are increasingly being overturned by historians of philosophy, the widespread rejection of the Aristotelian idea that nature was built of substances composed of matter and form, where the forms of these substances was understood by medieval philosophers to exemplify ideas in the mind of God, is nonetheless a striking discontinuity between medieval and modern notions of the natural order. The scientific revolution led by philosophers like René Descartes sought to explain the behavior of things in nature in terms of the intrinsic properties of their underlying matter and of universal laws which hold everywhere for all time. The notion of things having forms was pushed out of the picture. In Descartes' early modern synthesis, the laws of nature do not reflect eternal ideas fixed in the mind of God, but are created freely by God. But the revolution in the philosophy of nature did not stop there. Although Descartes considered minds to be exempt from scientific scrutiny, being knowable only by introspection, and believed humans to have immaterial souls, which interact with but are irreducible to their physical bodies, many modern philosophers since the Enlightenment have embraced scientism, which considers scientific knowledge to encompass all aspects of human existence, and have adopted some form of microphysicalism, which considers the whole of reality, including mind, to consist ultimately of some set of microscopic properties picked out by our best physics. According to one of the leading analytic philosophers of the last century, David Lewis, quote, all there is to the world is a vast mosaic of local matters of particular fact, just one little thing and then another. We have geometry, a system of external relations of spatio-temporal distances between points, and at those points we have local qualities. For short, we have an arrangement of qualities, and that is all. Such an account of nature seems to leave little room for human agency or human reason or the possibility of knowing or uniting with something that transcends nature. And such an account still sets the agenda for much of contemporary analytic philosophy. At the turn of the 20th century, however, the classical deterministic physics, which had shaped the imaginative landscape of many philosophers since the Enlightenment, was swept away by the new physics of quantum mechanics and relativity. Whilst the project of deconstruction was launched by anti-realist philosophers back in the 1960s, which challenged traditional conceptions of the progress of science in the light of the radical changes in theory introduced by the new physics, philosophers who identified as realists were less swift to assimilate these sweeping changes. David Lewis, for example, famously declared he was not ready to take lessons in ontology from quantum physics. Now, a new generation of philosophers is ready to take up this challenge, and in so doing have found themselves thinking again about medieval and early modern ideas about God, freedom, and nature. This course brings together 3 different approaches to the metaphysics of science, which are informed by contemporary physics, and 3 different answers to our basic question. All 3 of the philosophers who are going to be talking to you are united in rejecting the microphysicalism and scientism espoused by David Lewis. Each of these philosophers is at the forefront of advancing a humane metaphysics of science, which seeks to affirm the freedom and agency of human persons. Their philosophical conceptions of nature, however, as well as their attitudes toward the medieval synthesis of the scholastics, are pretty divergent. In this lecture, Brian Pitts, a senior research fellow of the University of Lincoln, will consider the coherence of a form of Cartesian dualism, in which human persons are immaterial substances which interact with the physical world. Brian will be focusing on the famous mind-body interaction objection against Cartesianism in the light of the physics of space and time. In the next lecture, on Wednesday, Michael Esfeld, a professor of the philosophy of science at the University of Lausanne, will seek to advance a weaker form of dualism, in which persons are not mental substances, but nodal points in a normative network of rights and obligations. Michael will consider the problem of human freedom in the light of quantum mechanics for a world in which everything seems to be quantum entangled. And in the third lecture on Friday, Robert Koons, a professor of philosophy at the University of Texas, will explore the possibility of rehabilitating the metaphysics of medieval scholasticism, in which human persons are substances composed of both matter and form. Rob will discuss the phenomenon of emergence in physics, and he might be mentioning some of my work too, which is rather exciting. In the Q&A at the end of these sessions, you will have the chance to quiz each of our lecturers on their particular topic after a short break in which you can formulate your questions. In the final session, however, Brian, Michael, and Rob will have the chance to respond to each other, and we shall have a more open-ended discussion. The content of that final discussion and just how theological it gets will depend very much upon you. Whilst listening to these lectures, I encourage those of you who are theologically minded to be thinking about any theological assumptions, perhaps unconscious theological assumptions, which may be shaping the different views of nature and freedom that you're going to be hearing about, with a view to bringing them to the foreground in our final discussion. Without further ado, let me turn you over to Brian.
Thank you very much, Will, for the kind introduction, and John and Keith, and thanks to all of you for being here as well. I'll be talking about a problem that has been widely discussed off and on, at least, since the 1690s, going back to the work of Leibniz. And yeah, so there'll be a bit of history in here. There'll be some philosophy of physics, and there will be some things about Einstein's general relativity that you probably won't have heard before.
Why, they went that way?
They went. Excuse me? So I should first thank the people who paid for this a few years ago when I was working in this project at Cambridge, including some collaborators, one of whom I'll mention later. And I should say, of course, any errors are mine, and thanks to Will for organizing. So first I'll say a little bit about what views of human persons are in view. So and then I will say something about precisely what this energy conservation objection to mental causation is. And then I will assert at that point what I take a good answer to be, and then the defense will come later, the explanation for why that's a good answer. And then I'll glance at the history to see if this view has been taken in the past, because there haven't been very many people advocating it in recent years. And we'll see that there's quite an impressive team in the 18th century. And then I will jump into some philosophy of physics to show how the view that I am outlining is more or less a mathematical theorem. And then I will turn to the topic of Einstein's general relativity, his theory of gravity, and ask how it affects this objection. And a few people have talked about that, but not very many. And I'm going to say something different from what other people have said on the topic. And it turns out this actually provides a better objection than the traditional one going back to Leibniz, but it's not one that should be effective against theists, as presumably many people who come to a lecture like this are. Okay, so what kinds of human persons are in view? So one might say broadly Cartesian souls, that is some sort of immaterial personal substance or key part of a person, which presumably is related to thinking, although maybe that's not as obvious as it looks as neuroscience progresses, related to consciousness, maybe intentionality, that is aboutness. I'm thinking about my childhood, let's say. But it doesn't necessarily mean Descartes' very own view. And that's important because a lot of people will bring up details of Descartes' very own view that are by no means universally shared and raise objections to those. And that doesn't seem very sensible to me. For example, Descartes thought that souls were not in space, but one might think, as some people like John Locke or Samuel Clarke did 300 years ago, or as Dean Zimmerman has suggested in recent years, maybe souls are in space. And that makes it a good deal easier to understand how this interaction might happen. So it doesn't necessarily mean Descartes' own view. Now, why might people be interested in believing in souls? Well, for example, personal identity, being the same person over time is a difficult question, and it's even more difficult in the context of a Christian or broadly Abrahamic view, or even maybe some other kind of view, such as reincarnation. So, what makes a resurrected version of me, say, the same person as the one who dies? Well, a soul gives a good answer to that question. Otherwise, it's quite difficult to answer that question. And you might also think, for example, suppose I'm a pattern. Well, my hard drive has patterns, and you could make many copies of it onto different flash drives. It would be strange, however, if it's possible to raise one person from the dead into many copies. So a soul would tend to provide an answer to that as well. So more broadly, souls are helpful for making sense of moral responsibility and any sort of eternal or at any rate posthumous rewards and punishments that one might believe in. There's also perhaps a bit of theoretical economy in that souls are qualitatively a bit like angels and God, which, I mean, if you already believe in God and perhaps angels anyway, then you don't have to introduce a new category of being in a sense, and it may give you some idea what the image of God might mean. Those are all just suggestive. So this is one set of views that has traditionally faced this energy conservation objection. But since the 1990s, there has been a family of views that has been considerably more fashionable. So the substance dualism, or broadly Cartesian view that I was talking about, became fairly unpopular in about the 1940s or 50s in academic philosophy. But in the 1990s, various people started suggesting a dualism of properties. So they're immaterial mental properties, qualitative raw feels, like what it's like to see red or to be a bat or something like that. But these are not supposed to belong to any immaterial substance. So it's not a dualism of substances. So some versions of this view, particularly originally, held that these properties didn't make any causal difference to what physical stuff does, or at best, maybe it was like having belt and suspenders to have two ways to make sure the same thing happened. But it didn't make any real difference, which means that, for example, the experience of seeing red would not be the cause of someone saying, I see red. But that seems like a bit of a disaster. So you might want to make sure that these mental properties do, in fact, make a difference to the physical world if their existence is supposed to explain why we talk about them or write about them. But in that case, you do wind up again with an energy conservation objection, just as Descartes faced from Leibniz. So I suspect that one would also face this objection given a hylomorphic, that is, matter and form sort of view that you find in Thomas Aquinas's integration of Aristotle and Christianity, such as Rob Koons will be talking about later on. I don't insist on that, but I suspect so. So I think basically most of the views that Christians and other theists have accepted over the years until very recently would face this sort of objection. So if humans have or are something irreducible to physics that makes a physical difference, a difference to the physical world, that sort of view will face this objection. Now, you could ask similar questions about angels or any other spiritual beings that someone might believe in, or even God, although few people complain about God's case. I guess the job description involves creating the world, and so most people think God ought to not be bound by conservation laws. Interestingly, in recent decades, some Christians have denied that we have souls, including Peter G.H. Clarke, who was a neuroscientist who had some sort of connection to the Faraday Institute, in fact, and Peter Van Inwagen, who emeritus philosopher at Notre Dame, who also spent some time at St. Andrews. And I could also mention Nancy Murphy. Both Nancy Murphy and Peter Van Inwagen have mentioned energy conservation as a reason to deny souls. So I think that this is an objection that has a long history, but it has currency as well. So it goes back, as I mentioned, to Leibniz starting in the 1690s publicly, and he talked about it quite a few times. I'll paraphrase this little quotation from the Theodicy in the 1710s. He says, well, we now have better conservation laws than Descartes. One of them is the conservation of what he called vis viva, or living force. Descartes thought it was something like volume times speed, but for Leibniz and Huygens, one had mv squared as a conserved quantity, which may look a bit familiar because it's 2 times kinetic energy from a later perspective. And then around the 1680s, the conservation of momentum was discovered by various people. So Leibniz said, if Descartes had had these cool conservation laws that we have now, then he would have embraced pre-established harmony as well. So pre-established harmony was Leibniz's idea that we have souls and we have bodies, but they don't interact with each other. Instead, God has sort of set things up in advance so that they're harmonized. Okay, so in this conservation objection wound up being revived very influentially in the later part of the 19th century. But I need to say a little bit about what happened before that. Philosophers of mind generally skip from about the 1710s to the 1900s as though nothing happened, or at least they assume that nothing relevant happened. But in the history of science, one finds that conservation of energy, also known as the first law of thermodynamics, being accepted in the 1830s and 40s. And then in the 1860s onward, you find people like Helmholtz, Dubois-Reymond, and W.K. Clifford, once again making a Leibniz-style conservation objection to interactionism. And there's a nice story about that in Germany by Wegener. I think I gave you that reference somewhere. Descriptively speaking, this revived objection was very influential. Here's the Victorian historian Frank Turner. The contemporary significance of this law of energy conservation was immense and probably more destructive to a supernatural interpretation of nature than was evolution by natural selection. To which I say, wow, that must have been a pretty influential objection. And you can still find a lot of philosophers of mind today who will make this objection. There are a couple lists that have some other names here in Montero and Collins and Gibb. And I'm saving 3 of my favorites for later. Before getting into those, I should say more about what precisely the objection is. So I'll have some premises on conclusion. So the first premise is supposed to be set up as a reductio ad absurdum. So this first premise is one that some people think we shouldn't ultimately accept. Premise 1, mental causation, in the sense that used above, makes a difference to how physical stuff behaves. 2, making a difference to how physical stuff behaves violates, or renders false anyway, the conservation of energy and or momentum. 3, energy and momentum are conserved. That's supposed to be true due to science, which of course you can read about in your high school chemistry book. And therefore, 4, no such mental causation occurs. So there went interactionism, it seems. Since the 19th century, unlike what Leibniz was interested in, people have used this objection against souls because they took for granted that interactionism was the only plausible version. So one might add a premise 5. If no such mental causation occurs, then there are no souls or non-physical mental properties or forms or whatever things that might be irreducible to physics and make a difference to what the physical world does. So this objection is made frequently and with considerable confidence. So I'll give some examples. So here's Dan Dennett. It is this principle of the conservation of energy that accounts for the physical impossibility of perpetual motion machines. And the same principle is apparently violated by dualism. This confrontation between quite standard physics is widely regarded as the inescapable and fatal flaw of dualism. Or here is, quite recently, Paul Churchland. He had in mind, he was thinking about property dualism of various sorts. Dualist properties that affect the physical world do fly in the face of basic physics itself, a rather more damning matter than flying in the face of folk psychology, since any position that includes non-physical elements in the causal dynamics of the brain must violate both the law that energy is neither created nor destroyed, and the law that the total momentum in any closed system is always conserved. There is simply no room in a physical system for ghosts of any kind to intervene in some fashion to change its dynamical behavior. Any physical system is dynamically closed under the laws of physics. And then finally, and most strikingly, Mario Bunha, recently deceased, said 40 years ago, dualism violates conservation of energy. If immaterial minds could move matter, then it would create energy. Energy, a property of all and only concrete things, would fail to be conserved. And so physics, chemistry, biology, and economics would collapse. Faced with a choice between these hard sciences and primitive superstition, we opt for the former. So if you're a logician, you might think this is an enthymeme, that is, an argument that has a suppressed premise somewhere, because there aren't any words shared of importance between the premises and the conclusion. Basically, he leaves us in the dark about what the argument is. But I might note, even Sauron or Palpatine could not make physics, chemistry, biology, and economics collapse with mental force. If they could, they wouldn't need all the orcs and stormtroopers. So here is another example of a strong assertion, but not a lot in the way of an argument. One can encounter sobriety, by contrast, from an old paper by my collaborator, Jeremy Butterfield, who said, and he mentions Dennett, this argument from conservation laws against interactionism is flawed for two reasons. The first reason is obvious. Who knows how small, or in some other way hard to measure, these energy gains and losses in brains might be. Agreed, this reason is weak. Clearly, the onus is on the interactionist to argue that they could be small, and indeed are likely to be small. The second reason is that a couple times people considered rejecting energy conservation. In short, physicalists need to be wary of bad reasons to think that physicalism is true, arising from naivete about physics. So you'll notice there's no panic about the idea that conservation laws might fail, and it's clear for Butterfield that any worthwhile objection would be quantitative and empirical, which is not what you usually see. And this is the difference between understanding conservation laws and submitting to them as a sort of oracle, I suggest. Okay, so what kinds of answers have been suggested by interactionists to this problem? Well, one answer is to simply deny that there's any violation of conservation of energy. And one problem with that is that it overlooks non-conservation of momentum. There are other problems as well. Another answer one sometimes hears is non-local compensation. The idea is if energy is created in the brain, maybe it's destroyed somewhere else simultaneously, so the total remains constant. Well, that overlooks the fact that conservation laws are local. Basically, it compensates for one crime with another crime. It also seems to commit one to absolute simultaneity, which you don't really want to volunteer for in light of relativistic physics. So another answer that one can hear is what I have called conditionality. That is, conservation is conditional on the lack of an external influence, like when there's no mind acting. And there are a few people who have had this idea. Garber is attributing it tentatively to Descartes rather than expressing his own view. And this has not been a very popular view in the 20th century, but I want to say this is actually the right thing to say, or most likely the right thing to say, at least unless we consider Einstein's general relativity. And another answer one might hear is that conservation laws already fail in general relativity, even apart from dualism, and therefore there isn't anything left for dualism to violate. Now, this is a very clever idea, but unfortunately it doesn't work, and there's some new math one can use to show that. Okay, so the sections do get shorter, I promise, so in case you're keeping track of the time, I want to say a little bit about the history. So Descartes had some notion of conservation, with which arguably interactionism is compatible. And Leibniz thinks Descartes would have given up interactionism if he'd had up-to-date conservation laws. On the other hand, Dan Garber, who is an expert on Leibniz, says there's reason to believe that Descartes may never have been committed to the position that his conservation law holds universally, and may have allowed for the possibility that animate bodies lie outside the scope of the laws that govern inanimate nature. So Descartes is, on Garber's view, a proponent of a conditionality answer. Moving a little more recently to Newton and his associate Samuel Clarke, the Newtonian tradition of forces could include mental forces. Clarke was the leading 18th century British philosopher of his era after John Locke was gone, and was Newton's stand-in the debate with Leibniz. Clarke was a libertarian about free will, so I can do A and I can do B, according to Clarke, which seems really unlikely to fit with conservation laws. But what about Newton? Well, Newton, in one of his drafts for the optics, talked about how there are active principles such as the power of life and will by which animals move their bodies with great and lasting force. So Newton is a strong proponent of mental causation and would not have been worried by this objection, it seems. So moving over to Germany, well, in Germany, Leibniz's views were continued and modified a bit by Christian Wolff and various followers, and were very influential for quite a while. But they're also criticized by people, including two whom I'll mention, one being Martin Knudsen. Knudsen is mostly remembered as a teacher of Immanuel Kant, but Knudsen also, according to Eric Watkins, was an interactionist, and he had something interesting to say. Basically, he said, well, these conservation laws aren't true if there is mental causation, and indeed they aren't even true for inelastic collisions. So an elastic collision would be things that hit each other and bounce back equally hard. Well, an inelastic collision might be two things that hit each other and stick, or hit each other and bounce off, but not equally hard. Knudsen also says, well, we shouldn't expect conservation to hold for the mind because that depends on the law of inertia, which doesn't hold for the mind. So according to Watkins, Knudsen said, well, the conservation laws can just fail. So Watkins doesn't have the view that this was the right answer, but it in fact is the right thing to have said. So Knudsen was an example of a conditionality response, and that seems to be typical for what the pietists said in that era. Another German philosopher who's relevant is Christian August Crucius, who says more or less the same thing. He said, well, if God were to create a world with these laws, then minds would not be able to affect anything in the world, and then matter would fail to fulfill the purpose for which God created it. So surely God wouldn't create a world with such laws, basically. So Crucius was an interactionist and embraced the conditionality response as well. So that's a pretty good team so far, but our best member, I think, is Leonhard Euler. Euler is one of the greatest mathematicians ever and the most prolific. He was also a physicist before the letter, if you will. Euler-Lagrange equations are crucial in physics to this day. And Euler basically invented what form conservation laws should take in the modern local form, where you have to consider everything place by place, and wrote equations for fluids. He realized conservation didn't always hold because of inelastic collisions, but he also held a distinct, he also took mental influence to be distinctive, and he was a vigorous opponent of pre-established harmony and of Wolffianism in general. He was also a Christian apologist and a defender of the Bible and the existence of evil spirits. This at a time when Frederick the Great was ruling and Voltaire was cool in Berlin. So Euler was not shrinking before the Enlightenment fashions. So I don't know that Euler explicitly addressed the Leibniz's objection, but it's pretty clear what he must have thought. He must have held the conditionality response because he couldn't have thought anything else or failed to think of it, I don't think, though I don't have a smoking gun. So why the 18th century? Well, for one thing, philosophy of mind has amnesia. E.J. Lowe, even, a well-known recently deceased dualist, thought there weren't any conditionality proponents in the 17th and 18th centuries, but we've just found a bunch of famous ones. Another reason is if the modern objection from energy and momentum is good, then the 18th century objection from momentum alone was good. But hey, Newton and Euler don't seem to have been worried, so it probably wasn't a very good objection. And indeed, interactionism, in fact, defeated pre-established harmony in the 18th century. So the view that's been reigning since the late 19th century actually lost the 18th century debate. Normatively speaking, pretty much nothing was changed by energy conservation. And this is my own view here based on understanding where these things come from. Whereas we saw descriptively, it made a huge difference according to Frank Turner. So it's not very useful to count noses philosophically these days. Indeed, physics experts tend to ignore or dismiss the objection, as indeed we've seen. Okay, so what exactly are conservation laws? Well, they do not, the primitive ones do not take the form energy equals constant or the like. They actually, that's called a global conservation law. The laws that you start with take into account the fact that energy and momentum have locations and move at finite speeds. This is basically from the 1870s onward. From the 1910s, that would subsume gravity and therefore include everything. And from the 1930s onward, there would not be any point particles, so we can easily handle things in terms of continua. Although, of course, there's quantum mechanics getting in there, making everything weird. Anyway, local conservation law says for each little volume, the energy or momentum or whatever in that volume changes only insofar as energy flows through the boundaries. So there's no teleportation, nothing pops into being, and nothing just disappears. So we can describe this mathematically in terms of an amount of energy per unit volume, rho, which depends on time and place, and an amount of energy per unit volume flowing in a particular direction, a particular rate. That's the energy current density, J, and likewise for momentum 3 times. So a local conservation law tells you the rate at which the amount of energy per unit volume increases over time, plus the second term here, it's a sort of a tendency of energy to spew out of the place in question, that sum is equal to 0. So if you've done vector calculus, you'll recognize this as a divergence of J. Anyway, now this is supposed to be true not at one place and one time, but at all places and at all times. So I need to introduce a universal quantifier here that's upside down A to just say at all times and places that equation. So this is not one conservation law. It's uncountably infinitely many. It's like one at every point in space, if you will, at each moment in time. So that's a whole lot of conservation laws. It's a much stronger claim than people tend to think, which is very relevant if you consider what it would be to deny this law. So what if we negate that universally quantified equation? Does that mean that energy conservation is false everywhere? Or does it mean that energy conservation is false somewhere? And those are two very different claims, aren't they? So there's ambiguity unless we write in the quantifiers. Well, the former is scary. Maybe that would be like Blunha's cataclysm, but it doesn't follow from the denial of the conservation laws. The latter, on the other hand, follows, but it isn't scary because maybe non-conservation is in places you don't care about, or maybe it is very small. Indeed, driven systems, systems subject to an external force, are very common and they're not typically unstable. So there's no reason to expect anything bad to happen. So non-conservation in brains, though surprising, would not threaten the thermodynamics of refrigerators or astrophysics, much less biology and economics. Okay, so another feature of conservation laws that is not widely recognized among philosophers is the connection between symmetries and conservation laws. Okay, so symmetries, that is uniformities of nature, imply conservation and vice versa. If the laws are the same over time, energy is conserved. If they're the same from place to place, momentum is conserved, and vice versa. And then from the 1910s, this mathematically framework came to seem sufficiently general. So as I mentioned, this goes both ways. That is especially formalized due to Emmy Noether's converse first Noether theorem. So that means energy and momentum indeed are not conserved in my brain during my life, assuming I have a soul that acts on my body and classical field theory is adequate. But is that absurd, or is that just maybe a result one could live with? So a lot of people think conservation laws are just energy is conserved. That's what it says in the chemistry book. But as Aristotle told us, if you're making a demonstration, your premises should be better known than and prior to your conclusion, not, for example, the same or equally well known or equally poorly known. So basically, this objection winds up being circular because the conservation is not any better known than the falsehood of interactionism. So there's no reductio here. There's just potentially conclusion. Unless, of course, you look at the brain. And that should be, if not decisive, at least extremely relevant. If you look at the brain and find there's no soul acting, that's very important. On the other hand, that is a totally different kind of argument. Otherwise, the conservation argument is basically just an incredulous stare. Okay, so the real experts are not physicists, but neuroscientists. So if a philosopher tells you that physics is against interactionism, well, that isn't the case, because any decent argument will be empirical and will involve looking at the brain. And looking at the brain may be discouraging. If so, so be it. But that is a totally different argument. Okay, so I'm going to say very little about quantum mechanics, though I'll briefly give you an excuse for why. Basically, quantum mechanics or quantum field theory is our best physics. Why do I ignore it to stick with our second best physics? Well, it's because I want to deal with the objection in its strongest form, and my job would be too easy, potentially, if I were to invoke some sort of quantum effects. Various people think quantum mechanics leaves more room for mental causation. So I will assume that's false in order to give myself a harder job. But the hardest job, as it turns out, could potentially be Einstein's general relativity, because while it's a classical field theory, in the relevant sense of classical, it's a very distinctive one. And it has had a controversy swirling around its conservation issues for 100 years. Which brings us to the question of what to make of the conservation laws in general relativity. Well, as I said, this has been controversial since the 1910s. Now, we wouldn't really want to have to resolve something controversial for 100 years in order to resolve something controversial for 300 years, but maybe we can learn something by relating these controversies. So formally, one can safely say general relativity has local conservation laws, but they involve what's called a pseudo-tensor, which is a mathematical quantity that seems to make energy appear or disappear just based on how you label things, which doesn't seem very sensible. So the long absence of any reasonable interpretation encouraged people not to believe this math, except in special cases. Interestingly, some lingering dissatisfaction remains, including, surprisingly, Roger Penrose. I say surprising given Penrose's mathematical style. So what can one say if one attends in detail to the mathematics of Noether's theorem and general relativity? Well, it turns out it has infinitely many translation symmetries of the laws, and infinity is a lot more than zero. Now, I emphasize laws because a lot of people will bring up a red herring at this point and say something about symmetries of geometry. Well, symmetries of geometry are interesting, and they do play a certain role, but they do not play the role of telling you whether Noether's theorem gives you a conserved quantity or not. So that's largely a red herring. So a question I asked myself around 2009 is, what happens if we try just believing the math? Which, interesting, nobody seems to have attempted to do previously, or at least not published. So if you believe that, then you find, hey, there are infinitely many energies in general relativity. So I've attempted to believe that, and now somebody else believes that too. Well, if that's right, then it seems that this should, if anything, strengthen the conservation objection rather than undermine it, as has been suggested. Well, Leibniz had a good policy. Try resolving controversies by calculating. And so that's what I'm going to do. You don't have to believe in infinitely many gravitational energies if you don't want to, because I have a quite independent argument. So Sean Carroll, the cosmologist, has rhetorically asked, how should we model mind-body interaction? Well, let's try giving it a shot. So let's say there are some mathematical quantities that depend on time and place that describe the mind's influence. Now, there may be more than one. I haven't made clear whether this is one number or many at a place, and that actually is quite important. But so we'll have modified gravitational field equations. So this expression would give us Einstein's general relativity field equations, but we're going to modify them by sticking some new term in. And I don't really know much about what this term would be like, but I will assume a few standard things. So what are these things here? So psi is the mental influence. G mu nu is the space-time metric, which encodes distances, times, gravitational pulls, and gravitational radiation. I'm letting U stand for whatever non-gravitational physical stuff there might be: electrons, neutrinos, quarks, the Higgs boson, whatever else there might be. And as before, I'm ignoring quantum physics for simplicity, though I don't think that would make a difference. If anything, it would make my job easier, so in a certain sense. Okay, so what can we say about this mental influence? Well, I'm going to assume, I mean, I seem to lack telekinetic powers, and I assume the rest of you do as well. So if I have a soul that can act on the physical world, presumably it acts in here and not elsewhere. So let's assume local field theory. So my soul can't do anything into my do anything into my backyard, let's say. So outside my brain, this quantity will be 0. But it's supposed to somehow implement my beliefs and desires in the body. Now you might wonder, how in the world does that work? How does my soul know what to do, so to speak? Well, that's an interesting engineering problem for God and/or evolution to solve, and for the neuroscientists to discover if these things happen. But it's not a philosophical objection. It's not something that a philosopher ought to know the answer to. But one can say psi, if it exists, modifies the equations of motion for matter and probably gravity. And that is enough to do a little bit of mathematics to learn something quite interesting, because one will still have a feature of general relativity called general covariance. That is a lack of preferred coordinate systems, which imply what are called generalized Bianchi identities, which sounds complicated. But anyway, the field equations are not all independent. Some of them imply others in such a way that if you try to modify Einstein's equations, it turns out you get some restrictions on what this mental influence psi is allowed to do. And in simple cases, you can show actually that psi has to be 0. In other words, my mind doesn't affect my body after all, or there's some other comparably bad disaster. In other words, interactionism just doesn't work. That's one. At least that's one of the troubles you can run into in general relativity, and that is completely different from earlier physics. Now, as I mentioned, that's assuming a simple case, and I don't know how many numbers there ought to be at each point in this quantity psi. So I've more or less assumed that there are at most 4, but that was really quite arbitrary. Basically, 4 is what I needed in order to get a disaster, so I assumed at most 4. But there could be more, maybe. Okay, well, I'm getting slightly ahead of myself. So note at this point, this is a non-circular objection. So unlike people from Leibniz to Churchland, I haven't assumed something equivalent to the denial of interactionism in order to infer the denial of interactionism. I've assumed actually there is interaction. I've made room for it, and the equation said no. So this is actually an objection that has some force, unlike the old one. But how much force it has actually depends a lot on your background beliefs. So there are always going to be 4 generalized Bianchi identities from general relativity, but there can be any number of components of psi. There might be one number at each point. There might be 4, 5, 8, 26, 137, whatever your favorite positive integer is, there doesn't seem to be any objection to that being the answer. Now, many people have noticed, whether they're theists or not, that dualism and theism tend to go together. The bulk of these people, of course, are theists and dualists. So an objection to interactionism that assumes atheism is going to be unsuccessful against most dualists, because it'll beg the question against their other views. And God famously has all power, wisdom, and, as Crucius pointed out, wisdom to create the world, motive to create the world in such a way as to have room for soul-to-body causation. So that being the case, or that being following from Christian or Muslim or Jewish views and the like, presumably God would engineer souls with enough and the right kinds of components to be able to overcome the generalized Bianchi identities and be able to act on matter. So it just takes a little better engineering, and then this objection actually gets handled. So the objection basically only gives atheists a reason to deny souls, but they probably did anyway on other grounds. So to conclude, conservation laws are local. That is, they depend, they hold place by place, and they hold if and only if there are uniformities of nature, symmetries of the laws. And therefore, the Leibniz to Churchland conservation objection is circular. But general relativity makes a difference, and it doesn't make things easier, as you might have heard. It actually makes things harder. So here, at last, is a non-circular argument. Quite a bit harder on atheism, I think, but not on theism. It doesn't really affect theists. So, recall I suggested if you are a realist about gravitational energy, then you'll think there are infinitely many conservation laws, which suggest that they should be stricter, and hence it should be harder for souls to act on bodies. And then this independent argument arrived at that same conclusion. So I think that's at least suggestive that gravitational energy realism is a good idea, though that's optional. What is clear is that there's a lot of relevant physics from the last 200 years that needs to be assimilated in the philosophy of mind. And also that we should be wary of claims about some sort of unified science. So many philosophers have attributed interesting results to physics that just aren't so. But physics is largely indifferent, or quantum mechanics maybe makes it easier, or general relativity makes a difference, but not what you might have heard. Neuroscience, on the other hand, may well be decisive, but that's a very different argument. So there are different sciences. One is not very relevant, and the other may well be. Now, I have not, you will notice, attempted to make a case for mind-body interaction or told you how it works in any detail. I have largely just addressed a famous, popular, longstanding objection to it, and shown that its status is not what you might have thought. And I think even with the improved objection from general relativity, it's still the case the conservation laws do not pose an objection for our place in the world. Thank you.